engine is frozen solid, comrade!
Try the starter again. We must move the artillery.
January 1940. Before dawn, the snow has already erased the road. The wind moves low across the ground, lifting white powder into the air like smoke. Trees stand rigid and silent, their branches bowed under ice. Somewhere beyond the forest line, engines have already faded. Tracks lead away, then vanish. What remains is cold, absolute, and tightening by the minute. A man stands where an army no longer is. His breath freezes before it reaches his scarf. Steel burns to the touch. The thermometer, if anyone were still checking it, has fallen far below what regulations were written for. In this place, sound does not travel far. Footsteps disappear within seconds. Orders issued hours ago no longer matter. He has been left behind, not by malice, but by necessity. A withdrawal measured in kilometers and minutes did not leave room for hesitation. Survival was never guaranteed. Rescue is impossible. Yet the storm is growing stronger. Snow begins to fall harder, driven sideways now, swallowing distance, shape, and direction. What should have been a death sentence starts to become something else. Not shelter, not mercy, something usable. And as the blizzard closes in, the war itself is about to change shape around it. By the winter of 1939 to 1940, Europe was already at war, but it was not yet the total, continent-shattering conflict history would later remember. In the West, armies sat behind fortifications. In the East and North, the war moved differently. Distance was greater. Infrastructure was thinner. And winter was not a season. It was a condition. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The decision came after failed negotiations over border security near Leningrad. Moscow believed the campaign would be brief. The Red Army possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, vast artillery reserves. On paper, Finland could not hold. But paper did not account for snow measured in meters or temperatures that fell below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Finland's eastern frontier stretched across forests, lakes, and marshland that froze solid in winter. Roads were few. Rail lines were limited. For centuries, the terrain had shaped Finnish life, and Finnish soldiers knew it intimately. The Soviet operational plan assumed movement along main roads, with mechanized columns pushing forward in depth. Once resistance was broken, infantry would follow. The weather arrived first. December set in early and brutally. Engines froze overnight. Lubricants thickened. Batteries failed. Weapons malfunctioned. Soldiers unfamiliar with extreme cold suffered frostbite within hours. Soviet winter equipment existed, but it arrived unevenly, and training in its use was inconsistent. Units advanced anyway, bound by orders written far from the front. Finland, by contrast, mobilized speed and knowledge rather than mass. Its army was small, poorly equipped in heavy weapons, and short on ammunition. But it was built around mobility. Ski troops moved where vehicles could not. White camouflage blended men into the landscape. Small units operated independently, relying on local supply and initiative. The global context mattered. Germany and the Soviet Union were still bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Britain and France condemned the invasion but hesitated to intervene directly. Finland stood largely alone. As Soviet columns pushed westward into Karelia and along the Raate Road, they entered terrain that stripped away their advantages. Forest closed in. Snow narrowed movement. Visibility shrank to tens of meters. Communications frayed. Units lost contact, not just with headquarters, but with each other. By January 1940, the war had slowed. Not because fighting had ceased, but because movement itself had become an enemy. Entire battalions were reduced to static clusters along frozen roads. Supply lines stretched thin and brittle. When storms hit, they did not merely delay operations. They isolated men completely. It was in these conditions that withdrawal orders were sometimes issued too late or followed too quickly. Columns pulled back under pressure, abandoning equipment, wounded, and stragglers to survive as best they could. In the cold, hesitation meant death. But speed carried its own cost. And sometimes, when engines failed and snow erased the path behind them, soldiers were left standing in a white silence where armies had been only hours before. That silence would soon force choices no doctrine had prepared for. The sector lay deep in northeastern Finland, near the long, narrow artery known as the Raate Road. On maps, it appeared harmless, a thin line cutting through forest and frozen lakes toward the town of Suomussalmi. In reality, it was a trap. Once winter closed in, the road became both lifeline and coffin. By late December 1939, elements of the Soviet 44th Rifle Division were moving along this route. The division was large, motorized, and heavily equipped. Trucks, artillery, field kitchens, ammunition wagons. Everything needed for sustained advance was packed into a single elongated column. Progress depended entirely on the road remaining open. It did not. Finnish forces, drawn largely from the 9th Division, operated in small detachments. Commanders such as Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo understood that direct confrontation was impossible. Instead, Finnish units began cutting the column into isolated segments, a tactic later known as the Mahti, a woodpile cut into manageable sections. Once isolated, Soviet units could not maneuver. Vehicles could not turn around. Tanks could not leave the road without sinking into deep snow. Infantry who tried to move into the forest lost direction almost immediately. Compasses froze. Landmarks vanished under snowfall. During one such engagement in early January 1940, as temperatures plunged and a heavy blizzard began to form, Soviet rear elements attempted to withdraw eastward. Orders were confused. Some units believed the road ahead was open. Others believed it already lost. Radio contact was intermittent, often silenced by cold or drained batteries. In the chaos, individuals were separated. Men fell behind while repairing frozen engines. Others stayed with wounded comrades as columns moved on. Some were simply swallowed by the storm. The Red Army's structure assumed cohesion and mass. Alone, a soldier had no doctrine, only instinct. For those left behind, survival depended on movement, but movement invited exposure. Standing still risked freezing. Traveling risked disorientation. Fires could save a life, but smoke could betray position. Every decision carried consequence. The Finnish side observed all of this. From concealed positions along the tree line, ski patrols tracked column movements without being seen. White uniforms erased human shape. The storm, growing stronger by the hour, masked sound and reduced visibility to almost nothing. What seemed like a liability to the abandoned became an opportunity to those who understood it. One isolated Soviet soldier, or small group, now stood between two realities: the certainty of freezing alone or the possibility of turning the environment into protection, concealment, even leverage. Reports from the period describe sudden attacks from nowhere. Supply sleds vanished. Outposts were found silent, their occupants frozen in place. The blizzard did not distinguish sides, but it rewarded those who adapted fastest. As night fell and the storm reached full force, the snow ceased to be merely weather. It became terrain in motion, rewriting the rules of visibility, sound, and fear. And within that moving white wall, the balance between hunter and hunted was about to reverse. Winter on the Raate Road was not merely uncomfortable, it was physiologically lethal. At temperatures approaching minus 40 degrees Celsius, exposed skin froze in minutes. Metal adhered to flesh. Breath crystallized inside scarves and beards, forming ice that cut the face raw with every movement. Medical reports from a winter war record frostbite cases occurring in under 30 minutes when gloves were removed. Prolonged immobility led to hypothermia even inside standard issue coats. Sleep, if it came at all, carried the risk of never waking. For isolated soldiers, endurance was not heroic, it was procedural. Movement had to be constant but economical. Calories were burned at extraordinary rates, yet rations froze solid. Soviet bread became inedible blocks. Tinned food required heat that could reveal position. Hunger weakened judgment, slowed reaction time, and magnified fear. Psychologically, isolation was worse. Snow absorbed sound, creating a silence so complete that men reported hearing their own heartbeat. Disorientation followed quickly. Without landmarks, direction lost meaning. In such conditions, panic was often fatal. Finnish troops were not immune. Their advantage lay in preparation. Years of civilian life in the North had taught them how to pace movement, how to rest without freezing, how to read the snow itself. Wind-carved ridges, tree drift patterns, subtle gradients invisible to outsiders. The difference was not courage. It was familiarity. In this environment, the cold punished mistakes instantly, but it also imposed limits equally on both sides. Survival depended on turning discipline into habit and habit into instinct. Those who adapted could endure. Those who did not became still figures in the snow, preserved by the very cold that killed them. And endurance alone, under the right conditions, could begin to shape the fight itself. Snow changed everything the manuals assumed. Marching formations collapsed. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Commands could not be shouted without revealing position. Even whistles sounded dull and directionless. For Soviet units trained for coordinated advance, this was crippling. Columns stretched thin. Gaps opened. Commanders could not see beyond the lead vehicles. Artillery became difficult to deploy. Guns froze in place, their recoil systems sluggish or inoperative. Finnish units exploited this fragmentation. Operating in groups as small as 4 or 5 men, they moved on skis along forest lines parallel to the road. They did not seek decisive battles. They sought disruption, cutting telephone lines, ambushing supply sleds, harassing sentries. Snow muted gunfire, making it difficult to determine direction or distance. A brief burst could sound like it came from everywhere at once. Darkness arrived early, and under overcast skies, day and night blurred together. The blizzard amplified these effects. Tracks vanished within minutes. Footprints meant nothing. Retreat routes disappeared. The road, once a guide, became a narrow corridor of exposure. Under such conditions, even a single soldier who understood how to move, hide, and wait could exert influence far beyond his numbers. The environment magnified small actions into large consequences, and as the storm deepened, the battlefield became less about force and more about perception. Who could see, who could hear, and who could endure the longest? The snow was no longer neutral. It was beginning to choose sides. For Soviet troops on the Raate Road, the blizzard did not feel like cover. It felt like entrapment. Visibility collapsed to the length of a truck. Snow packed itself into boots, gloves, rifle actions. Frostbite spread from toes upward, numbing limbs until pain vanished and movement slowed. Reports from the 44th Rifle Division described confusion that bordered on paralysis. Orders contradicted one another. Units believed flanks existed where there were none. Men fired at sounds, at shadows, at nothing. In several instances, soldiers advanced toward what they believed were friendly positions, only to discover frozen vehicles and silent camps abandoned hours earlier. Fear compounded the cold. Finnish ski troops were rarely seen, but always felt. Shots came from the forest and vanished. Sentries disappeared. At night, men reported hearing movement without seeing anything at all. The snow absorbed sound and scattered it unpredictably, making direction impossible to judge. Morale eroded quickly. The Red Army's strength lay in mass and coordination. The storm denied both. Individual soldiers, trained to operate within a rigid structure, now had to improvise alone. Many could not. Some attempted to break into the forest to escape the road. Few succeeded. Without skis or training, deep snow consumed energy rapidly. Direction was lost within minutes. Several accounts record soldiers found later within a few hundred meters of the road, frozen upright, rifles still slung. The enemy was no longer just Finnish troops. It was exposure, hunger, and uncertainty forces that could not be fired upon. Far from the snow, command assumptions unraveled slowly. Soviet doctrine emphasized speed, concentration, and armored support. Winter conditions were considered obstacles, not decisive factors. The belief persisted that momentum would compensate for discomfort. On the ground, officers faced impossible choices: halt and risk freezing, advance and risk ambush, withdraw and abandon equipment and men. Communications delays meant that orders often arrived after circumstances had already changed. Finnish leadership operated differently. Decentralization was not a weakness but a necessity. Junior officers and non-commissioned leaders were expected to make independent decisions. If conditions changed, adaptation was immediate. Success was measured not in kilometers gained, but in enemy capability reduced. The blizzard exposed these contrasting philosophies. Where rigid hierarchy struggled, flexibility thrived. The storm punished hesitation and rewarded initiative. What began as weather became a test of systems, training, leadership, and cultural expectation under pressure. As the blizzard reached its peak, those differences would no longer remain theoretical. They would determine who moved, who froze, and who controlled the road when the snow finally settled. The storm arrived fully on the night of January 5th, 1940. Wind speed increased sharply, driving snow horizontally across the Raate Road. Visibility collapsed to less than 10 meters. Even at arm's length, shapes blurred into white distortion. The temperature fell further, locking machinery into immobility. Engines that had run hours earlier refused to start. Artillery breach mechanisms stiffened. Fuel gelled inside tanks and trucks. Along the road, the Soviet column fractured completely. What had once been a division became isolated clusters of men and vehicles, separated by stretches of empty snow. Communication between these pockets ceased almost entirely. Field telephones were useless. Radios failed. Messengers sent on foot vanished into the storm. In several positions, fires were lit despite the risk. Without heat, survival was impossible. Flames flickered behind trucks and half-buried guns, throwing shadows across snowbanks that no longer resembled solid ground. Every fire was visible from far beyond the road, even through falling snow. Finnish ski patrols watched. Moving parallel to the column, they did not rush. Speed was unnecessary. The storm masked their approach, erased their tracks, and dulled sound. Ski poles whispered over packed snow. White cloaks broke up outlines until men appeared as drifting shapes, then disappeared again. Small actions multiplied. A supply sled was taken. A field kitchen destroyed. A sentry removed quietly. Each loss reduced the column's ability to survive the cold by degrees that compounded rapidly. Hunger deepened. Exhaustion set in. Confidence drained away. At one isolated segment, Soviet troops attempted to organize a breakout toward the east. Without clear bearings, the attempt stalled almost immediately. Men moved in circles. Those who stopped to rest could not rise again. Frost claimed fingers first, then hands, then will. The blizzard did not simply hide the battlefield. It compressed it. Distances shortened. Time slowed. Every decision carried immediate consequence. By dawn, the road was no longer contested ground. It was a frozen corridor of immobile targets. And within the storm, Finnish commanders recognized that the moment had arrived. What had been containment was about to become destruction. By the morning of January 6th, 1940, the storm still raged, but its work was already done. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division no longer functioned as a fighting formation. It existed only as fragments, groups of men clinging to frozen vehicles, isolated gun crews guarding weapons they could no longer fire, officers issuing orders no one could carry out. For the Finnish forces surrounding the Raate Road, this was the decisive moment. Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo did not order a frontal assault. There was no need. The blizzard had immobilized the enemy more effectively than artillery ever could. Instead, Finnish units intensified a method they had refined over weeks: systematic destruction of isolated pockets, one at a time, using speed, surprise, and the cold itself. Ski troops struck silently. They approached from the forest, moving into range before being detected, often not detected at all. Shots were brief and deliberate. Targets were command vehicles, radios, officers' supply wagons. Then the attackers vanished back into the trees, leaving confusion behind. The snow swallowed their tracks almost instantly. In several instances, Finnish soldiers waited for Soviet troops to abandon vehicles in search of warmth before moving in. Once engines were cold-soaked beyond recovery, retreat became impossible. Tanks and trucks, designed to dominate open ground, became static steel shelters that slowly drained body heat. Some Soviet units attempted resistance. Machine guns fired blindly into the forest. Artillery crews tried to bring guns into action, only to find recoil systems frozen solid. Ammunition shattered when handled. Frostbitten hands could not reload quickly enough. The blizzard magnified every Finnish advantage. Sound was distorted. A single rifle crack echoed like a platoon firing. Shadows moved unpredictably. Soviet soldiers could not tell how many enemies surrounded them, or from which direction the next attack would come. Fear filled the gaps left by uncertainty. By nightfall, the Raate Road had become a graveyard of equipment. Hundreds of vehicles stood abandoned, engines silent, snow drifting over hoods and gun barrels. Fires burned low or had gone out entirely. In many positions, the cold had finished what gunfire began. When the storm finally began to ease, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The 44th Rifle Division had ceased to exist as an operational unit. Estimates vary, but Soviet losses on the Raate Road numbered in the thousands, killed, wounded, captured, or frozen where they stood. Finnish casualties were comparatively light, though not insignificant. Everybody paid a price in that cold. The blizzard had not merely shaped the battle. It had decided it, and as the snow settled over the silent road, the scale of what had occurred began to emerge, forcing both sides to reckon with a truth no staff map could ignore. When the fighting along the Raate Road finally ceased, the silence was unlike any before it. There was no movement, no engine noise, no shouted commands carried on the wind. Snow drifted slowly across abandoned vehicles, softening the outlines of destruction that stretched for kilometers through the forest. Finnish troops moved cautiously. What they found was staggering. Columns of trucks stood frozen in place, some still loaded with food, ammunition, and winter clothing that had never reached the men who needed it. Artillery pieces sat half-buried in snowbanks, their barrels angled uselessly toward the trees. Tanks, once symbols of modern warfare, were immobile metal shells, their crews gone. Casualty estimates for the Soviet 44th Rifle Division vary by source, but most historical accounts place losses between 7,000 and 9,000 men, including killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Many were found days later, frozen where they had fallen, beside vehicles, in shallow forest shelters, or along the road itself. Finnish losses, by comparison, were significantly lower, estimated at several hundred casualties across the operations at Suomussalmi and Raate Road. These numbers did not reflect ease. Every casualty carried weight in a small army already stretched thin. But the disparity revealed how completely the environment had shifted the balance. Captured Soviet equipment transformed Finnish capabilities almost overnight. Trucks, machine guns, rifles, radios, and large stockpiles of ammunition were recovered. Perhaps most importantly, winter clothing and boots, items Finland lacked in quantity, were redistributed to frontline troops. The enemy's logistical strength became Finnish survival. International observers took notice. Reports reached London, Paris, and Berlin describing an army defeated not by mass firepower, but by isolation, cold, and maneuver. The myth of the Red Army's invincibility cracked publicly for the first time. Within the Soviet Union, the outcome triggered urgent reassessment. Senior commanders were dismissed. Tactics were questioned. Training manuals began to change. Winter warfare, once assumed manageable, now demanded respect. But beyond numbers and reports, the battlefield itself told a harsher story. The Raate Road stood as physical evidence that modern armies could be rendered helpless if they misunderstood where they were fighting. The snow had not melted. The lessons were still freezing into place. The defeat on the Raate Road did not end the Winter War, but it altered its trajectory. For Finland, The victory proved that survival was possible, not through strength of numbers, but through mastery of terrain and conditions. For the Soviet Union, it was a warning written in ice. In the weeks that followed, Red Army Command moved quickly to adapt. Units were reorganized. Winter equipment distribution was prioritized. Training emphasized movement in snow, camouflage, and decentralized initiative. Heavy reliance on roads was reduced. Where possible, these changes would later shape Soviet performance in the broader war that followed. Yet adaptation came at a cost. The psychological impact of Raate Road lingered among troops who would fight again in similar conditions. Veterans carried memories of isolation, cold, and an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere. The fear of being cut off in winter forests became a permanent undercurrent in northern operations. For Finnish forces, the battle entered national memory almost immediately. It reinforced a strategic truth that had guided planning from the beginning. Endurance and intelligence could offset material disadvantage. The concept of Mahdi warfare was refined and taught as doctrine, influencing later defensive operations throughout the war. Internationally, the engagement reshaped perceptions. Germany, watching closely, noted both the Red Army's vulnerabilities and its capacity to learn. Less than 18 months later, during Operation Barbarossa, German planners would draw flawed conclusions, underestimating Soviet resilience while remembering its winter failures too vividly. The terrain itself bore scars. Vehicles were stripped and removed, but traces remained. Disturbed snow patterns, splintered trees, frozen ruts that lingered into spring. For years, locals would find remnants emerging from melting drifts. Metal, cloth, and sometimes bone. The cold had taken more than lives. It had reshaped doctrine, reputation, and confidence. It reminded every army watching that nature was not a backdrop to war. It was an active participant. And in that realization lay the deeper meaning of what had occurred on that frozen road. The snow eventually melted on the Raate Road. Forests reclaimed their stillness. Tracks vanished, and the frozen silence that once held an army dissolved into spring water and mud. But the lesson endured long after the ice released its grip. The Winter War revealed a truth that modern warfare often forgets. Technology, numbers, and planning matter, but only within the limits allowed by environment. When those limits are ignored, even the most powerful force can be rendered fragile. On that road in January 1940, men did not lose simply because they were outmaneuvered. They lost because they were unprepared for where they were fighting. The blizzard did not favor one flag over another. It offered the same cold, the same darkness, the same danger to everyone. What differed was understanding. One side treated winter as an inconvenience to be endured. The other treated it as terrain to be mastered. There were no grand speeches in the snow. No recorded moments of triumph. Only quiet decisions made under pressure. When to move, when to wait, when to let the storm do the work that bullets could not. Those choices determined survival. In the decades that followed, armies would study winter warfare more seriously. Manuals would be rewritten, equipment redesigned, training altered. Yet no document could fully capture what those men experienced in that white silence. Because some lessons are not learned in classrooms or command tents. They're learned standing alone in a blizzard, realizing that the environment itself has become a weapon and deciding whether it will be used against you or for you.